A millionaire paid a fortune for a garbage collector to have his child. When the baby was born, he fainted upon seeing that the baby had the same birthmark that only his father had. The midday sun mercilessly punished the recycling cooperative yard, transforming the air into a dense, suffocating mass that stuck to the skin like a second layer of sweat. Claire adjusted her torn gloves while separating plastic bottles from aluminum cans, her agile fingers working with the precision of someone who had spent years in that exhausting routine. The faded blue uniform, stained with grease and dust, clung to her thin body, and she stopped only to wipe away the sweat that constantly ran down her forehead. Next to her, Margaret kept the same rhythm, although Claire noticed that her mother was breathing with more difficulty on that particularly hot day. The other collectors worked in silence around them, each focused on their pile of materials, the noise of plastic and metal creating a monotonous symphony that filled the open space. Claire observed her mother discreetly, noticing how she paused more often than usual, leaning on the sorting table. "Mom, are you all right? Would you like me to get you some water?" Claire asked, concern tinging her voice. Margaret forced a tired smile and shook her head negatively. Margaret was a woman who never complained, even when her body begged for rest after decades of heavy work under adverse conditions. Claire knew well that stubborn pride her mother carried as a shield against life's difficulties, a resistance forged in years of struggle to raise a daughter alone. Margaret's hands, marked by scars and calluses, continued to separate materials with automatic movements, but Claire noticed they were trembling slightly. The heat seemed to suck all energy from the environment, creating waves of mirage over the cracked asphalt of the yard. Claire tried to focus on her own work, but her eyes always returned to Margaret, who now leaned more frequently on the edge of the table. Her mother's forehead glistened with a thick layer of sweat, and her cheeks, normally reddened by exertion, were as pale as paper. Claire dropped the bag she was filling and walked to her mother, gently touching her shoulder. "Mom, let's take a break. This heat is too much today," Claire insisted, her voice laden with concern she could no longer disguise. Margaret shook her head stubbornly, but her legs visibly wobbled. The next moment happened as if time had slowed down in a cruel and inevitable sequence that Claire would relive in nightmares for a long time. Margaret brought her hand to her chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of her uniform, as if trying to pull something out from inside, and her eyes widened in silent panic. Claire saw her mother's body begin to tilt to the side, her knees giving way as if all her bones had turned to jelly. The scream that came from Claire's throat was primitive, a sound of pure terror that echoed across the yard and made all the collectors instantly stop what they were doing. Margaret suddenly fell to the ground, unconscious. Claire ran to her mother's side, desperate to help her and calling for help. The other collectors rushed to assist, forming a circle around the two women, but Claire could only see her mother's pale and motionless face. "Mom! Mom! Please wake up!" "Someone call an ambulance," Claire shouted, tears already blurring her vision. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Claire's hands trembled violently as she caressed Margaret's face, desperately trying to wake her with gentle touches that became increasingly urgent. One of the collectors, an older man who had worked at the cooperative for years, knelt on the other side and checked Margaret's pulse with experienced fingers. Claire observed his face for any sign of hope, but the grim expression she found made her stomach turn. Another collector was already on the phone, shouting the cooperative's address to emergency services, his voice competing with the noise of trucks passing on the nearby street. Claire could feel the heat of the concrete burning through the fabric of her pants, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the terror growing in her chest. Margaret remained unconscious, her breathing so weak that Claire had to place her ear close to her mother's nose to make sure she was still alive. Minutes crawled by like hours, each second an eternity of agony as they waited for the ambulance. "The ambulance is coming," said the older collector, trying to comfort her. Claire nodded mechanically, but her tears fell onto Margaret's motionless face. The distant sound of the siren brought a wave of relief mixed with even greater fear, as it meant that the situation was too real to be just a nightmare from which she could wake up. Claire held Margaret's hand, feeling the cold, damp skin against hers, and whispered fragmented prayers she had learned in childhood. The paramedics arrived rushing with a stretcher, their white uniforms a stark contrast to the dusty environment of the cooperative. They gently but firmly moved Claire aside, beginning to check Margaret's vital signs with professional efficiency. Claire watched every movement, every expression on the paramedics' faces, desperately searching for some sign that everything would be all right. One of them placed an oxygen mask on Margaret's face, while the other prepared an injection, their quick and precise movements indicating the seriousness of the situation. Claire tried to get closer, but was stopped by one of the paramedics who explained they needed space to work. "What's wrong with her? Will she be okay?" asked Claire, her voice breaking into sobs. The paramedic kept his focus on his work as he responded. The more experienced paramedic, a man with a graying beard and steady hands despite the urgency, glanced briefly at Claire while continuing to stabilize Margaret. His voice was professional but not devoid of compassion when he finally answered, his fingers still checking vital signs as he spoke. Claire clung to every word as if they could change the frightening reality before her. The other paramedic was already preparing the stretcher for transport, each movement calculated and efficient, trained by years of emergencies. The man adjusted the oxygen mask on Margaret's face and checked her pupils with a small flashlight, his brow furrowed in concentration. Claire could see that the situation was serious by the way they worked, quick but careful, as if they were handling crystal that could break at any moment. Around them, the other waste pickers had formed a silent circle, some murmuring prayers, others just watching with worried faces. "We need to take her immediately. It appears to be something neurological, but we can only be sure at the hospital," said the paramedic, signaling to his partner. Claire felt her legs weaken at the words. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights, screaming sirens, and the constant movement of paramedics working on Margaret's motionless body. Claire pressed herself against the wall of the vehicle, trying to occupy as little space as possible while watching the professionals fight to stabilize her mother. The heart monitor emitted irregular beeps that made Claire's heart jump with each variation in rhythm. One of the paramedics administered medications through an intravenous line, while the other maintained radio contact with the hospital, using medical terms that Claire did not understand, but which sounded terribly serious. The streets passed in flashes through the small windows of the ambulance, the outside world reduced to smudges of color and movement. Claire held Margaret's hand whenever the paramedics allowed, feeling how fragile and small she seemed at that moment. The smell of disinfectant and medications filled the confined space, mixing with the odor of sweat and fear emanating from Claire. "We're almost there," said one of the paramedics, noticing the desperation in Claire's eyes. She wanted to believe, but Margaret's silence screamed louder. The community hospital was an organized chaos of people waiting, crying, shouting for care in overcrowded corridors that smelled of cheap disinfectant and human desperation. Claire ran alongside the stretcher as the paramedics took Margaret straight to the emergency room, passing dozens of other patients waiting in broken plastic chairs. The double doors of the emergency room closed in Claire's face with a definitive thud, leaving her outside, helpless and lost. A nurse with a crumpled uniform and deep dark circles asked her to wait and fill out some forms, pushing a clipboard into her trembling hands. Claire tried to focus on the questions, but the letters danced before her tear-blurred eyes. Name, age, medical history, information that seemed absurdly trivial, when her mother was fighting for her life on the other side of those doors. She sat in a hard chair, the cold plastic against her sweaty skin, and tried to fill out the papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Is she allergic to any medication?" asked the nurse, returning to collect the forms. Claire shook her head negatively, her voice stuck in her throat. Claire finally managed to find her voice, although it came out hoarse and broken by the contained crying that tightened her throat like an invisible hand. She looked at the nurse, trying to convey through her gaze all the desperation she felt, hoping that somehow this would make a difference in the treatment Margaret would receive. The nurse took the shakily and incompletely filled forms, her experienced eyes quickly capturing the essential information. Claire noticed how other people in the hallway observed her, with that mixture of pity and relief that they weren't in her place, each dealing with their own personal tragedies. The clock on the wall marked each minute with cruel precision, and Claire began to count the seconds, as if she could control time through sheer willpower. A child was crying in her mother's lap a few chairs ahead, and the piercing sound made Claire's heart tighten even more. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Margaret's face smiling, healthy, alive. But the image that always came was of the collapsed body on the cooperative floor. "No, she's not allergic to anything that I know of. Please do everything to save her," Claire finally managed to say. The nurse nodded and disappeared through the double doors. The hours dragged on with torturous slowness, each minute an eternity of uncertainty and fear that corroded Claire from the inside like acid. She walked through the narrow corridor, counting the cracked tiles on the floor, memorizing every stain on the peeling walls, anything to keep her mind occupied. Other patients and family members watched her with looks of silent understanding, all united in that involuntary brotherhood of suffering. Claire tried to pray, but the words scrambled in her mind, transforming into a desperate mantra repeated infinitely. She thought of all the moments she had taken for granted, all the mornings she had woken up with Margaret preparing coffee in the tiny kitchen, all the tired smiles after a hard day's work. Guilt consumed her for not having insisted more that her mother rest, for not having noticed earlier that something was wrong. The clock on the wall marked the passage of time with ticks that sounded like hammers in her head. "Family of Margaret Collins?" called a deep male voice. Claire jumped from the chair as if she had received an electric shock. The doctor was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many tragedies to maintain any trace of naive optimism. He guided Claire to a small side room, away from the chaos of the hallway, and the sudden silence was almost suffocating. Claire sat on the edge of a chair, her body as tense as a rope about to snap, while the doctor consulted the clipboard in his hands. The walls of the room were a depressing hospital white, decorated only with faded posters about hygiene and disease prevention. The doctor pulled up a chair and sat facing Claire, his movements deliberate and careful, as if preparing to deliver bad news. Claire could feel her heart racing, blood pulsing in her ears like the roar of the ocean. The air conditioner hummed above them, the only sound besides Claire's tense breathing. "Ms. Claire, your mother has suffered a severe cerebral aneurysm. It's an extremely serious condition," the doctor began, his voice professional but not devoid of compassion. Claire felt the world tilt on its axis. The doctor opened a folder with exams and began showing the images to Claire, pointing to dark and light areas that made no sense to her, but his grave expression said it all. His hands moved over the images with clinical precision, tracing the path of the hemorrhage in Margaret's brain. Claire tried to follow the explanations, but the technical words scrambled in her mind, already overloaded with fear and confusion. The doctor took a pen and began to draw on a paper, illustrating in simpler terms what had happened. Claire observed each stroke, each circle representing a part of her mother's brain that was in danger. The room seemed to have gotten smaller, the air denser, as if the walls were closing in on her. The doctor continued speaking, his voice maintaining a professional tone that could not completely mask the gravity of the situation. "The aneurysm is located in a critical area of the brain. There has already been significant bleeding, and without immediate surgical intervention, the condition will rapidly worsen," explained the doctor, his eyes meeting Claire's. She felt her hands begin to tremble again. Claire leaned forward, her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails cut into her palms, the physical pain being the only thing that kept her anchored to reality. The doctor continued showing the exams, each image a death sentence in black and white that Claire couldn't accept. She could see the dark shadow of bleeding in the images, a stain that seemed to be devouring Margaret's brain. The doctor explained that the aneurysm was like a weak balloon in a blood vessel, which had already begun to leak and could rupture completely at any moment. Claire felt each word like a stab, her breathing becoming shorter and more difficult. The room was silent except for the doctor's voice, but Claire could hear her own heart beating like a drum in her ears. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but her throat was closed with fear. "But she can be saved, can't she? You'll operate on her here?" Claire managed to ask, her voice no more than a desperate whisper. The doctor hesitated, and that moment of silence was like a scream. The doctor adjusted his glasses and took a deep breath before continuing, his fingers lightly drumming on the table in a gesture that betrayed his own discomfort with what he had to say. Claire watched his every movement, desperately searching for any sign of hope in his body language. The room seemed to have gotten even colder, the air conditioning blowing directly on her like the icy breath of death. The doctor looked directly into Claire's eyes. and she could see the mixture of professionalism and compassion struggling in his expression. He put the exams aside and joined his hands on the table, clearly preparing for the most difficult part of the conversation. Claire felt as if she were on the edge of a precipice, about to be pushed into a bottomless abyss. The silence stretched for a few seconds, that seemed like hours before the doctor finally spoke. "Mrs. Claire, unfortunately, our hospital does not have the resources needed to perform this surgery. We don't have the specialized microneurosurgery equipment, nor the team trained for a procedure of this complexity," the doctor said, each word falling like a stone in Claire's stomach. She felt the world crumbling around her. Claire was silent for a moment, processing the doctor's words as if they were in a foreign language she was desperately trying to translate. Her mind refused to accept what she was hearing, creating excuses and alternatives that didn't exist. The doctor waited patiently as she struggled to find her voice again. Claire looked at the images of Margaret's brain spread out on the table, those dark spots that represented death approaching. She thought of all the taxes they paid, all the politicians' promises about improving public health, and now when she needed it most, the system was abandoning her. Anger began to mix with despair, creating an emotional storm that threatened to explode. Claire raised her eyes to the doctor, and he must have seen something in her expression that made him continue quickly. "But there is an alternative. There is a private clinic specialized in neurosurgery that has all the necessary resources. They have saved many patients in similar situations," the doctor said, picking up a pen to write. Claire clung to these words like a shipwreck survivor to a floating piece of wood. The doctor wrote the name and address of the clinic on a paper with careful letters, as if the precision of his handwriting could somehow increase Claire's chances of getting help. He handed the paper to her, but kept his hand on it for a moment before releasing, a gesture that Claire interpreted as reluctance to give false hope. Claire took the paper with trembling hands, reading the name of the private clinic as if it were a prayer. The doctor continued explaining that the clinic had the best neurosurgeons in the region, state-of-the-art equipment, everything Margaret needed to survive. Claire was already getting up, ready to run there and beg for help, when the doctor stopped her with his next words. He explained that he needed to be honest about the costs involved, that he didn't want to create false expectations. Claire sat back down, her body suddenly heavy as lead. "Doctor, how much does the surgery cost? I'll do anything, pay in installments, work at the clinic to pay, anything," Claire said, desperation showing in every word. The doctor took another piece of paper and began writing numbers. The doctor finished writing and pushed the paper across the table to Claire, his eyes full of a compassion that made the situation even more painful. Claire took the paper and looked at the numbers, blinking several times because surely she was seeing wrong. Surely there were too many zeros there. She looked at the doctor and then at the paper again, her brain refusing to process the magnitude of that amount. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life, more than she could earn in a decade of working at the cooperative. The doctor explained that the amount included the emergency surgery, the ICU days, the specialized medications, the medical team, and all necessary post-operative follow-up. Claire felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. It was absurd, completely impossible. She crumpled the paper in her hand, tears flowing freely now. "This amount is impossible for me. I'm a garbage collector, doctor. I don't make this in 10 years of work. Are you telling me my mother will die because we are poor?" Claire asked, her voice rising in desperation. The doctor lowered his eyes, unable to deny the cruel truth. The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive, filled only by the hum of the air conditioner and the muffled sounds of the hospital beyond the door. The doctor seemed to be struggling with his own words, clearly uncomfortable with the injustice of the situation, but powerless to change it. Claire watched his face, looking for any sign that he had a magical solution hidden, but found only the resignation of someone who had had this conversation many times before. He mentioned government assistance programs, but immediately explained that the process was time-consuming, with waiting lists that stretched for months. Claire thought about how many others were in that same situation, how many families destroyed by the cruel combination of disease and poverty. The doctor continued talking about charity organizations, but each option came with caveats, bureaucratic processes, specific criteria, time that Margaret didn't have. Claire felt as if she were drowning in a sea of impossibilities. "Doctor, how much time does my mother have? If we can't get the money for the surgery, how much time does she have?" asked Claire, her voice barely audible. The doctor took a deep breath before answering, clearly reluctant. The doctor looked at Claire with an expression that mixed medical professionalism with genuine human sadness. His fingers interlaced on the desk as he carefully chose his words. Claire could see that he didn't want to answer, that he preferred to give vague hopes rather than confirm the worst, but she needed to know the truth, however brutal it might be. The silence stretched between them like an abyss, each second increasing the tension in the small room. The doctor finally looked directly into Claire's eyes, and she saw in them Margaret's death sentence even before he spoke. He explained that the aneurysm was a ticking time bomb, that it could rupture at any moment, causing massive hemorrhage and instant death, or it could bleed slowly, causing progressive damage to the brain. Claire felt each word as an additional weight on her already overburdened shoulders. The doctor picked up his pen again and drew a simple diagram showing how the bleeding was pressing on vital areas of the brain. "Being completely honest, Ms. Claire, without the surgery, your mother has at most 48 hours. It could be less if there's another bleed," said the doctor, his voice soft but definitive. Claire felt the doctor's words echoing in her mind, like a definitive sentence as she rose from the chair with wobbly legs. 48 hours transformed into a cruel hourglass, counting the last grains of sand in Margaret's life. The doctor remained seated, observing her with that mixture of professional compassion and helplessness that Claire was beginning to hate, because it meant that even those who dedicated their lives to saving others could do nothing for her mother. She looked once more at the paper with the cost of the surgery, the numbers dancing before her eyes as if mocking her poverty. And then she carefully folded it and put it in her pocket, as if it were a talisman that could somehow transform into real money. The doctor stood up too, adjusting the white coat that seemed so clean and distant from the world of dirt and hard work that Claire knew. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders and looked directly into his eyes, a fierce determination momentarily replacing despair. "Doctor, I will get this money. I don't know how, but I will. Please do everything you can to keep her alive until I return," said Claire, her voice trembling but determined. The doctor nodded, although his expression showed that he didn't believe she would succeed. Claire left the small consultation room and walked through the hospital corridors with determined steps, ignoring the pitying looks from other patients and family members who recognized in her the desperation of someone about to lose a loved one. She stopped briefly at the ICU to see Margaret once more, looking through the glass at her mother's fragile body, connected to so many machines, and made a silent promise that she would return with salvation. The morning sun hit her like a slap when she left the hospital, the outside world continuing its indifferent routine while hers crumbled. Claire looked at her reflection in the hospital's glass door and saw her worn garbage collector clothes, stained from the previous day's work, disheveled hair, eyes red from crying. She tried to tidy herself up as best she could, smoothing her faded blue uniform and tying her hair in a tight ponytail. She needed to look presentable if she wanted anyone to take her seriously for a loan request. "I only have a few hours to save her. I need to do whatever it takes," Claire muttered to herself. She began walking toward downtown, each step a battle against exhaustion and despair. The journey to the banking district was a torture of anxiety and frantic mental planning. Claire rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain her situation, what guarantees she could offer for a loan she knew was almost impossible to obtain. The streets grew wider and cleaner as she approached the financial center, buildings growing taller and more imposing, reflecting a world of money and power that seemed to exist in another dimension compared to her reality. People in expensive suits rushed past her, talking on modern phones about business and values that could save 1,000 Margarets without even noticing her presence. Claire stopped in front of the first bank she found, an imposing building of tinted glass and marble that looked like a temple dedicated to the god of money. She took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart, and rehearsed her speech once more. Her hands trembled as she checked the documents she had brought, work ID, proof of residence, any paper that might prove she was an honest, hard-working person. "I can do this. I have to. It's for my mother," Claire said, forcing herself to push the revolving door. The air conditioning enveloped her like a cold embrace, and she shivered despite the heat she had left behind. The interior of the bank was even more intimidating than the exterior, all polished marble and chrome metal, with well-dressed people moving around with the confidence of those who belonged in that world. Claire headed to the information desk, where a blonde receptionist with perfectly manicured nails and a blazer that probably cost Claire's monthly salary examined her from head to toe. The woman's nose visibly wrinkled, as if she had smelled something unpleasant, and her professional smile completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of poorly disguised disgust. The receptionist looked at Claire's stained clothes, her calloused hands, her worn shoes, and then looked around as if checking if anyone important was seeing this inappropriate person in their pristine environment. Claire tried to explain that she needed to speak with a manager about an urgent loan, but the receptionist interrupted her before she could finish the sentence, her voice loud enough for other clients to hear. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place? We have standards here. Perhaps you should try an agency in the suburbs, more suitable for your profile," said the receptionist, pronouncing the word profile as if it were a curse word. Claire felt her face burn with humiliation, but she stood firm. Claire insisted that she needed to speak to a manager, that it was a medical emergency. But the receptionist rolled her eyes and made an exaggerated gesture of disgust, moving away as if Claire were contagious. The woman grabbed a bottle of hand sanitizer and ostentatiously cleaned her hands, even without having touched Claire, the gesture clearly intentional and humiliating. Other employees began to notice the scene, some whispering among themselves and chuckling, others discreetly pointing at Claire. The receptionist finally, with obvious reluctance and making a grimace, pointed to a line where other people were waiting, all much better dressed than Claire. As Claire walked away, she could hear the receptionist commenting to a colleague about the need to improve security to prevent this kind of people from entering the bank. Claire positioned herself in line, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, but she could feel all eyes on her, judging, condemning, excluding. An elderly lady with expensive jewelry visibly moved away when Claire stood behind her in line, pulling her designer purse closer to her body. "My God, what is this beggar doing here?" the lady whispered to her companion, loud enough for Claire to hear. Tears of anger and humiliation burned her eyes, but she held them back. When it was finally her turn, after almost an hour of humiliating waiting where she had to endure whispered comments and looks of disgust, Claire was directed to a table in the back, away from the sight of more important customers. The manager was a young man, no more than 25 years old, with too much gel in his hair and a suit that screamed nepotism more than competence. He looked at Claire with such disdain that she almost turned to leave, but thought of Margaret and forced herself to sit down. The manager didn't even bother to introduce himself, just kept looking at her, as if expecting her to realize on her own that she didn't belong there. Claire began to explain about her mother, about the aneurysm, about the urgency of the situation, but the manager interrupted her with a sarcastic laugh that attracted the attention of everyone around. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and examined her as if she were a curious zoo specimen. "Let me see if I understand. You, a garbage collector, with these smelly clothes and this deplorable appearance, want me to approve a loan of astronomical value?" said the manager loudly, ensuring everyone heard. Claire felt as if she had been publicly slapped. The manager continued his public humiliation, standing up and circling around Claire like a vulture, pointing out every aspect of her appearance that offended him. He mentioned the smell of garbage emanating from her, the stains on her clothes, the dirt under her nails, each observation more cruel than the previous one, clearly enjoying the show he was providing to other employees and customers. Claire tried to show her documents, explain that she had a steady job, that she could provide guarantees, but the manager took the papers with his fingertips and threw them back at her without even looking. He then called the security guard, a huge man who approached with a malicious smile, clearly accustomed to this type of situation. The manager sat back down and looked at Claire with pure contempt, his eyes running over her worn uniform with disgust. "People like you are the reason why we have to disinfect the bank every day. Did you really think you could walk in here looking like a homeless person and walk out with money? What a joke," exclaimed the manager, laughing. Claire stood up abruptly, her face burning with humiliation and anger. Claire tried to maintain some dignity while collecting her documents with trembling hands, but the manager wasn't finished with her. He also stood up and began to speak even louder, ensuring that everyone in the bank heard every humiliating word. He said that the bank had standards, that it wasn't a charity house, that people like Claire should know their place in society and stop bothering those who really mattered. Other customers now openly watched the spectacle, some laughing, others filming with their cell phones, turning Claire's humiliation into entertainment. The security guard grabbed her by the arm with unnecessary force, his fingers painfully squeezing, while dragging her toward the exit. Claire stumbled, almost falling, and heard more laughter. The receptionist from earlier waved sarcastically at her, making a shoe gesture as if chasing away an animal. Claire was practically thrown out of the bank, stumbling on the sidewalk and falling to her knees on the rough ground. "And don't come back, this bank is for real people, not human trash," shouted the security guard before closing the door. Claire knelt there, tears finally falling freely. Claire remained kneeling on the sidewalk for several moments, the world around her a blur of tears and humiliation. People passed by her, some looking with curiosity, others diverting their path as if her misery was contagious. She finally managed to stand up, legs trembling, and leaned against the building wall. The paper with the surgery cost had fallen during the commotion and was now being trampled by hurried passers-by. One more indignity in an already unbearable day. Claire picked it up, now dirty and torn, and put it in her pocket as a reminder of her failure. She wiped her face with the back of her hands. It was then that she heard a loud, irritated male voice coming from the square in front of the bank. A young man wearing an impeccable grey suit was gesturing furiously while talking on the phone. Claire observed him through her blurred vision, noticing the expensive leather briefcase he had placed on the bench beside him. "I don't care about procedures. I need to solve this now. My time is running out," the man shouted into the phone. Claire straightened up, something about the desperation in his voice resonating with her own. Ethan Calloway continued his heated discussion, completely oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded in the bank behind him. Claire could see the frustration in every line of his tense body, the way he ran his hand through his perfectly arranged hair, destroying the expensive hairstyle in his agitation. He took short steps back and forth, moving further and further away from the bench where he had left his briefcase. Claire observed as he shouted about deadlines, about finding the right person, about heirs and legacies, words that didn't make complete sense to her but that were clearly of extreme importance to him. The contrast between them was striking, he with his rich people problems, she with her struggle for basic survival. But there was something in his desperation that was familiar, the same raw urgency that she felt. Ethan ended the call with a whispered curse and violently put the phone in his pocket. He stood still for a moment, breathing heavily, then began to walk quickly toward the private parking lot. "Sir, your briefcase," shouted Claire, her voice hoarse from crying so much. But he was already too far away, getting into a silver sports car that shone like a mirror under the midday sun. Claire ran as fast as her exhausted legs would allow, ignoring the pain in her bruised knees and the dizziness from not having eaten anything since the day before. She waved her arms frantically, shouting until her throat hurt, but the roar of the sports car's engine drowned out any chance of being heard. The vehicle smoothly left the spot and accelerated down the street, disappearing into traffic in a matter of seconds. Claire stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, breathless and defeated, hands resting on her knees as she tried to catch her breath. She looked back at the square where the briefcase still was, abandoned on the bench as if waiting for her. Claire walked slowly back, each step a decision that brought her closer to something that could change everything or condemn her even more. The square was strangely deserted for that time of day, just a few pigeons pecking at crumbs near a trash bin. Claire sat down next to the briefcase, not touching it yet, her eyes fixed on the leather object that represented a world to which she would never belong. What does someone like him carry in such an expensive briefcase? Claire thought out loud. Claire looked around the square once more, checking if the owner of the briefcase was coming back to retrieve it. The square remained deserted, only pigeons pecking at crumbs near the trash bin, indifferent to the abandoned object on the bench. The golden clasps of the briefcase shone in the sun, not locked, just closed. Claire needed to find some identification inside to be able to return it to the owner. Her fingers found the clasps while looking for an external tag with a name, but there was nothing. She needed to open it to find the owner. The first clasp opened with a soft click. "I need to discover who the owner of this briefcase was to return it," murmured Claire, opening the second clasp. The briefcase opened, revealing its contents, and Claire completely lost her breath. The interior of the briefcase was lined with blood-red velvet, and meticulously organized inside was more money than Claire had seen in her entire life. Stack after stack of high-value notes, held with elastic bands and piled with obsessive precision. Claire felt her hands begin to shake violently as she looked at that fortune, her brain trying to process what she was seeing. It was enough money to pay for Margaret's surgery, enough to save her, enough to change their lives forever. But it was also money that didn't belong to her, money from a man who was probably desperately searching for it. Claire touched one of the bills with the tip of her finger, as if checking if it was real, and the texture of the paper confirmed it wasn't a dream. Along with the money were business documents and a card with the name Ethan Calloway and a business address. Claire was paralyzed, looking from the money to the card. There was everything, the address to return it and the money to save Margaret. The dilemma tore her inside like a blade. Her mother was dying, had only hours to live, and there was salvation within her reach. "What do I do? Mom, what do I do?" whispered Claire, tears running down her face. Her hands trembled over the money, temptation and conscience warring within her. Claire closed the briefcase with slow and deliberate movements, each click of the clasps sounding like a hammer in her shattered heart. Her hands were shaking so much that she had to try 3 times before managing to close it completely. And when she finally did, she hugged the briefcase against her chest as if she could somehow absorb the solution through the expensive leather. The money was there, Margaret's salvation was there, but Claire knew her mother better than anyone. Margaret would rather die honest than live knowing her life was bought with stolen money. Claire stood up from the bench, her legs wobbly like jelly, and looked one last time in the direction of the hospital where her mother was dying. Then, with a determination that came from a place deeper than despair, she turned to the opposite direction, toward the business address written on the card. Each step away from the hospital was agony. Each meter traveled could be the last wasted moment of Margaret's life. "Mum, I hope you understand. I need to do this the right way," Claire muttered, clutching the briefcase tightly. Her tears fell on the dark leather, leaving small spots that dried quickly under the merciless sun. The address on the card led to one of the most imposing buildings in the business district, a mirrored glass tower that reflected the sky and seemed to touch the clouds. Claire stopped at the entrance, looking at her reflection in the glass doors. A destroyed woman in dirty and wrinkled scavenger clothes, carrying a briefcase worth more than her entire life. The contrast was so absurd that she almost laughed, a hysterical laugh that died in her throat when she thought of Margaret. The security guard at the entrance examined her with obvious suspicion, clearly preparing to bar her entry. But Claire showed Ethan Calloway's card and said she had something urgent to deliver to him personally. The guard verified the name, made a quick call, and with evident surprise allowed her to enter. The lobby was all white and black marble, with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Margaret's surgery. Claire crossed the space feeling like a stain of dirt in an immaculate world. 15th floor, office 1500, informed the receptionist after checking the system. Claire entered the elevator, the briefcase weighing increasingly heavier in her hands. The elevator ride seemed to last an eternity. Each passing floor was another second stolen from Margaret's precious time. Claire watched the numbers changing on the digital panel, fighting the impulse to press the emergency button and run back to the hospital with the money. When the doors finally opened on the 15th floor, she found herself in a luxurious hallway with thick carpet that muffled her steps. The walls were decorated with artwork she didn't understand, but recognized as expensive, and the air had a smell of polished wood and expensive perfume. Claire followed the room numbers until she found 1500, a double dark wood door with a discreet plaque that said, Calloway Enterprises. She stopped before the door, took several deep breaths trying to control the tremor in her hands, and knocked. An elegant secretary opened the door, examined Claire with the same suspicious look she had encountered everywhere that day, but upon seeing the briefcase, her eyes widened. "I need to speak with Mr. Ethan Calloway." "It's about this," said Claire, slightly raising the briefcase. The secretary practically pulled her inside. Ethan's office was even more impressive than the building's lobby, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, leather furniture that seemed never to have been touched, and a massive wooden desk that appeared to have been carved from a single giant tree. Ethan had his back turned, talking on the phone in front of the window, his silhouette outlined against the sunlight. Claire could hear fragments of the conversation, something about deadlines, about the urgent need to resolve a situation, about time running out. The secretary discreetly cleared her throat, and Ethan turned around, his eyes immediately fixing on the briefcase in Claire's hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan muttered something into the phone and hung up, crossing the office in quick strides. He stopped a few steps from Claire, his eyes alternating between her and the briefcase, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Claire extended the briefcase to him, her hands visibly shaking. "You forgot this on the park bench." "Everything is in there. I didn't touch anything," said Claire, her voice breaking at the end. Ethan took the briefcase, still looking at her with absolute perplexity. Ethan opened the briefcase right there, his fingers flying over the latches with an urgency that revealed how important the contents were. Claire watched as he verified the money, quickly counting some bundles, checking the documents, his face gradually relaxing as he confirmed everything was intact. When he finished, he closed the briefcase and looked at Claire with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. It was a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something more, something like admiration. He placed the briefcase on the table and turned to look at her again, this time really seeing her, noticing her worn clothes, her tear-stained face, her calloused and hurt hands. Claire could see the questions forming in his mind: why she had returned it, what had motivated her, who was this woman who was giving up a fortune. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Ethan finally sat on the edge of his desk, an informal gesture that seemed out of place in that formal environment. "You saved my company, this money, these documents. How can I reward you?" asked Ethan, his voice laden with genuine gratitude. Claire felt tears returning to her eyes. Claire shook her head negatively, taking a step back when Ethan made a move to approach. She cleaned her face with the back of her hand, trying to regain some composure before this powerful man who looked at her as if she was some kind of incomprehensible phenomenon. Claire knew that any normal person would have accepted a reward, would have even asked for one, but she wasn't just anyone. She was Margaret's daughter, and Margaret had taught her that doing the right thing needed no reward. Claire straightened her shoulders, gathering the last vestiges of dignity she still possessed after an entire day of humiliations, and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. She could see that he was genuinely confused by her refusal, accustomed to a world where everything had a price, where every action expected an equivalent reaction in monetary value. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to say, knowing she was giving up any help for Margaret. "I don't need anything in return, Mr. Calloway. I returned it because it was the right thing to do, that's all," said Claire, her voice surprisingly firm. Ethan was left speechless, clearly not expecting that answer. Claire was already turning to leave when her phone started ringing, the strident sound cutting through the awkward silence that had settled in the office. She picked up the device with trembling hands, seeing the hospital number on the cracked screen, and her heart immediately raced. Claire excused herself with a gesture and answered, turning to the window to have a minimum of privacy. The nurse's voice on the other end was professional but laden with urgency, and each word she said was like a stab in Claire's already shattered chest. The nurse explained that Margaret had suddenly and severely deteriorated, that a secondary hemorrhage had begun, and that she was being prepared for immediate transfer to the ICU. The doctors were doing everything possible to stabilize her, but without the surgery it was just a matter of time, and not much time. Claire tried to ask questions, but her voice wouldn't come out, her throat completely closed by panic. "Ms. Claire, if you want to say goodbye, it would be good to come as quickly as possible," said the nurse with that terrible gentleness of healthcare professionals. Claire mumbled a thank you and hung up, the phone slipping from her suddenly strengthless hands. Claire fell to her knees on the soft carpet of the office, the impact cushioned, but the emotional pain so acute that she felt as if she was being torn apart inside. The sobs exploded from her chest with a violence that frightened her, each one tearing away pieces of her soul. She tried to get up, but her legs were jelly, her arms were water, her whole body had turned into liquid pain. Claire hugged her own body, bending until her forehead touched the carpet, and cried as she hadn't cried since childhood, without shame, without control, without hope. She could hear movement around her, concerned voices, but none of it mattered because Margaret was dying, her mother was dying, and she had chosen honesty over her life. Claire felt Ethan kneel beside her, felt his hand hesitant on her shoulder, but she couldn't stop crying, couldn't form words, couldn't do anything but drown in her own guilt and despair. My mother, I can't save her. I had the chance and didn't take it, she managed to say between sobs, each word cut off and wet. Ethan gently squeezed her shoulder, and Claire could feel his confusion. Ethan helped Claire to get up from the floor, guiding her to one of the leather armchairs that seemed like clouds compared to the hard floor. The secretary had brought water and tissues, placing them on the side table before discreetly withdrawing, closing the door behind her. Claire drank the water in desperate gulps, as if she could drown the pain, and tried to clean her face, but the tears kept falling, an endless river. Ethan sat in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, his face showing genuine concern mixed with curiosity. Claire could see the questions in his eyes. What chance she had had, why her mother was dying, what had happened. She took several deep breaths, trying to calm her sobs enough to speak. Claire looked at her calloused hands, unable to meet Ethan's eyes, and began to tell her story in halting phrases. My mother had a brain aneurysm 2 days ago. The public hospital can't perform the surgery. The private clinic costs a fortune I'll never have, Claire said, each word an agony. Ethan straightened in the armchair, beginning to understand. Claire continued talking, the words now flowing like water from a broken dam, telling about her life as a garbage collector, about the poverty that defined every aspect of her existence, about Margaret, who had worked her entire life and was now dying because the healthcare system only saved those who could pay. She told about the humiliations at the bank earlier, about how they had treated her as less than human, about all the doors she had knocked on that were slammed in her face. Ethan listened in absolute silence, his eyes never leaving Claire's face, absorbing every painful detail. Then Claire reached the hardest part, finally looking into his eyes as she confessed. She told about opening the briefcase, about seeing all that money, about holding Margaret's salvation in her hands. Claire described the inner battle, the moment when she had to choose between saving her mother and maintaining her integrity. Ethan was completely still now, barely seeming to breathe. I could have taken the money, I could have saved her, but my mother taught me to be honest, and I couldn't save her with stolen money, Claire said, a new wave of tears falling. Ethan rose abruptly, going to the window. Ethan stood at the window for long moments, his hands crossed behind his back, looking at the city below. Claire could see the tension in his shoulders, some kind of internal battle happening inside him. When he finally turned, there was something different in his expression, a determination mixed with something Claire couldn't identify. He sat down again, but this time pulled the armchair closer, his knees almost touching hers. Ethan leaned forward and took Claire's hands in his, a gesture so unexpected that she tried to pull them back, but he held firm. Claire could feel the warmth of his hands, soft and uncalloused, so different from hers. Ethan seemed to be searching for the right words, opening and closing his mouth several times before finally speaking. His voice was hoarse with emotion when he began. Claire, you had in your hands the solution to save the person you love most in the world, and you chose to return it because it was the right thing to do. That is, I've never met someone like that, Ethan said, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. Claire tried to pull her hands again, uncomfortable with the praise. Ethan didn't release Claire's hands, squeezing them gently as he continued, his voice gaining urgency. Ethan quickly guided her through the office, passing by the surprised secretary and straight to the private elevator. Claire followed him in a state of shock, not fully understanding why this rich and powerful man was getting involved in her personal drama, but too grateful to question. In the elevator, Ethan made a quick call, his authoritative voice ordering his car to be prepared immediately. Claire could feel the urgency emanating from him, a nervous energy that made her fear even more for Margaret's condition. The elevator doors opened directly into the private parking lot, where the same silver sports car she had seen earlier was waiting with the engine running. Ethan opened the passenger door for her, a chivalrous gesture that seemed absurd given the circumstances, and ran to the driver's side. The car left the parking lot with a roar of the engine, tires squealing on the concrete. Claire clutched the seatbelt, while Ethan navigated through traffic with a mixture of skill and calculated recklessness. The journey to the hospital was a blur of speed and anxiety, Ethan cutting through traffic with the precision of someone accustomed to being in a hurry and having the resources to get away with the consequences. Claire alternated between looking at the speedometer rising dangerously and closing her eyes, praying they would arrive in one piece and on time. Buildings passed like smudges through the window, and Claire had the surreal feeling of being in a movie, not in her real life. Ethan finally answered her question, his voice tense as he made a sharp turn that threw Claire against the door. He said he recognized the desperation in her eyes, that he himself knew the feeling of losing something vital and being unable to do anything about it. His words were interspersed with honking and sudden braking, the car weaving between other vehicles like a metallic snake. Claire wanted to ask more questions, to understand the motivations of this stranger who had entered her life like a hurricane, but the hospital appeared ahead, and all other concerns vanished. Emergency entrance. "It's faster," said Ethan, making a sharp turn that almost put them on the sidewalk. The car stopped with a jolt in front of the automatic doors. Claire jumped out of the car before it had completely stopped, rushing through the emergency doors with Ethan right behind. The hospital was in its usual controlled chaos, but something seemed different, more urgent. Claire ran to the reception, where the same tired nurse from the previous shift recognized her immediately. The nurse's expression changed from professional boredom to something close to panic, and Claire felt her heart sink. The nurse quickly came around the counter and approached, guiding the scavenger toward the elevators. Ethan followed them, his imposing presence automatically making people clear the way. The nurse spoke rapidly as they walked, explaining that Margaret had suddenly deteriorated about 20 minutes ago, that the doctors were doing everything possible, but the situation was critical. Claire felt her legs growing weak, but the nurse's firm hand and, surprisingly, Ethan's support at her back kept her moving. "Is she conscious? Is she suffering?" asked Claire, her voice breaking. The nurse hesitated before answering, and that moment of silence said it all. The elevator doors opened on the ICU floor, and Claire ran down the hallway, ignoring the nurse's protests about restricted visitation. She could see through the ICU glass a commotion around one of the beds, Margaret's bed. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, machines beeped in alarm, and Claire could see her mother's body convulsing among them. Claire tried to enter, but was physically prevented by a large nurse who held her gently but firmly. She fought against him, shouting Margaret's name, begging to let her in. Ethan appeared at her side, placing his hands on her shoulders, trying to calm her, but Claire was beyond any consolation. She watched the doctors trying to revive Margaret with all available resources in an intense fight for life. Claire stopped fighting, her entire body trembling as she watched the doctors fighting for her mother's life. "Please, please, please," Claire repeated like a mantra, not knowing if she was speaking to God, to the doctors, or to Margaret herself. Ethan embraced her by the shoulders, offering silent support. Long minutes passed, each second an eternity of agony, as Claire watched the medical team work. The lead doctor, the same one who had given the initial diagnosis, was sweaty and clearly exhausted, but continued compressions with fierce determination. Claire could see in his face that the chances were diminishing with each moment. Another procedure was performed, but the vital signs still remained unstable. Claire felt her legs give way and Ethan supported her, helping her sit in a nearby chair without taking his eyes off the terrible scene through the glass. The medical team applied intensive emergency procedures, doing everything to stabilize Margaret. Claire recognized the organized desperation of a medical team doing absolutely everything possible, even knowing it was probably too late. Time seemed to distort, minutes stretching like hours, each failed resuscitation attempt tearing away another piece of Claire's soul. "She's strong. "She's a fighter," Ethan said softly, but Claire could hear the doubt in his voice. She clenched her fists until her nails cut into her palms, the physical pain nothing compared to the terror of losing Margaret. Suddenly, there was a change in the energy inside the ICU. The lead doctor stopped the compressions and looked at the monitor, his eyes widening. Claire stood up, pressing her face against the glass, trying to see what was happening. The other doctors also stopped, all looking at the cardiac monitor. For a terrible moment, Claire thought it was the end, that they were declaring Margaret dead. But then she saw the doctor gesture urgently, and the team returned to action with renewed energy. But this time their movements were different, less frantic, more focused. A nurse ran out of the ICU and almost collided with Claire. She stopped briefly, breathless, and said they had managed to get a weak but stable heart rhythm, that Margaret was fighting. The nurse continued running, probably to fetch more equipment or medications. Claire sobbed with relief, but the lead doctor came out of the ICU with a grave expression. "Ms. Claire, we managed to stabilize her for now, but the situation remains critical. The aneurysm is actively bleeding. Without immediate surgery, she won't make it," said the doctor, sweat dripping down his face. Claire looked at him in total despair. Claire felt the world spinning around her, the doctor's words echoing in her mind like a death sentence, postponed by minutes. She looked through the glass at Margaret, seeing her mother small and fragile among all those machines, fighting for each heartbeat. The doctor continued explaining that the bleeding had increased dramatically, that Margaret's brain was being compressed, that every minute without surgery exponentially decreased her chances of survival or recovery. Claire turned to him, ready to beg again for the impossible, when she felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder. She had almost forgotten he was there, this strange and unexpected presence in her darkest moment. Ethan stepped forward and asked the doctor exactly how much it would cost and how long it would take to transfer Margaret for immediate surgery at a private clinic. The doctor blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting this question, and began explaining the costs and logistics. Claire watched the conversation as if underwater, the voices reaching her muffled and distorted. "Doctor, if money is no object, how long to save her?" Ethan asked with authority. The doctor stuttered that with unlimited resources, Margaret could be in surgery within an hour. Ethan immediately took out his phone and started making calls, his voice taking on a commanding tone Claire hadn't heard before. He spoke to people about bank transfers, about preparing operating rooms, about having the best neurosurgeons available immediately. Claire watched him in shock, unable to process what was happening. Within minutes, Ethan was negotiating with the hospital administration, signing papers, authorizing payments that made the staff's eyes widen. Claire tried to protest, to say she couldn't accept, but Ethan silenced her with a gesture. He turned to her while waiting for another call to connect and said he would explain everything later, that now the important thing was to save Margaret. Claire had no strength to argue, all her energy focused on praying that her mother would hold on a little longer. The medical team was informed that the transfer had been approved, and they began preparing Margaret for transport. Claire was allowed to approach for a moment. "Hang on, Mum, just a little longer. You're going to make it," Claire whispered, kissing Margaret's cold forehead. The paramedics arrived with the private ambulance. Claire accompanied Margaret's stretcher to the state-of-the-art ambulance that Ethan had arranged, holding her mother's hand throughout the journey. Margaret was unconscious, intubated, with multiple medication lines keeping her alive. The paramedics were clearly elite professionals, constantly checking vital signs, adjusting medications, communicating with the clinic that awaited them. Ethan followed in his car, and Claire could see him through the rear window, keeping close to the ambulance. During the journey, one of the paramedics explained that the clinic was already prepared, that as soon as they arrived, Margaret would go straight to the operating room. Claire nodded, unable to speak, focused only on transmitting strength to Margaret through touch. The private clinic appeared like a mirage of glass and steel, with a medical team waiting at the entrance. Margaret was transferred with military efficiency, and Claire had to run to keep up. In the corridor leading to the surgical center, she was stopped by a nurse. "You need to wait here. We'll do everything possible," the nurse said gently. Claire watched the double doors close behind Margaret. Ethan appeared beside Claire moments later, gently guiding her to a private waiting room. It was a luxurious space, with leather armchairs, a large screen television, and even a small area with coffee and snacks. The contrast with the community hospital waiting room was striking. Claire let herself fall into one of the armchairs, completely exhausted physically and emotionally. Ethan sat in another nearby armchair, giving her space but remaining present. For several minutes they sat in silence, Claire trying to process everything that had happened. Finally, she turned to Ethan, needing to understand. He anticipated her question and began to explain. He said that when she returned the briefcase, when she chose honesty even knowing it condemned her mother, he saw something extraordinary. And then, hearing her story, her desperation, something clicked in his mind. Ethan explained that he needed someone special for an important purpose, someone with the kind of character that Claire had demonstrated. "I have a proposal for you, Claire. One that can change everything," said Ethan, leaning forward. Claire stared at him, without energy to protest or question. Ethan took a deep breath before continuing, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Claire, you need to understand something. I discovered 6 months ago that I have a progressive medical condition. In a few years I will be completely sterile. My time is running out. My father is aging, wanting to see the Calloway name continue, and I've always dreamed of being a father. Not just passing my name on, but really being a father. Teaching a child to ride a bike, helping with homework, passing on values, raising someone to be better than me," said Ethan, his voice laden with emotion. He released Claire's hands and stood up, beginning to pace around the office. "I interviewed dozens of women over the past few months, all beautiful, educated, with impeccable resumes. But when I asked why they wanted to carry my child, do you know what they answered? They talked about money, advantages, what they would buy afterward. None of them saw the child as a person, as someone who would deserve love. For them, it would just be a 9-month transaction. But you, Claire, you returned a fortune to do the right thing. What kind of mother would someone like that be? What values would they pass on to a child?" asked Ethan, suddenly stopping. Claire observed him, torn between his confession and Margaret dying. "I know it's a lot to process, but think about it. Your mother lives, gets the best possible treatment, and you help me with something I desperately need. I know what I'm asking is too much. It's a noble action. I know pregnancy is very important to a woman, and I'm asking you for a great thing. But if I could choose, I would like my child to have a mother like you, someone honest," said Ethan. Claire looked at him, then at the door where Margaret was fighting for her life. A nurse entered the room to give an update. The surgery was progressing, but it was complex and would take several hours. Margaret was stable for now, but the next moments would be critical. Claire thanked her, and the nurse left. She turned to Ethan, her exhausted brain trying to process the impossible proposal. Carrying a child for a stranger, under normal circumstances, it would be unthinkable, but nothing in her life was normal at that moment. Claire thought of all the doors that had been slammed in her face, all the humiliation she had suffered, how the system had condemned Margaret to death for being poor. And now this man was offering not only to save Margaret, but to ensure she would have the best possible care. She could see in the millionaire's eyes that he wanted an heir, a man who dreamed of having a child not for status, but because it was his dream. She knew it was a truly noble gesture. So many people had done the same for those who couldn't have children. She herself dreamed of having a child one day. It would be the fulfillment of a dream for her as well, though not in the circumstances she had imagined. Claire stood up and went to the window, looking at the well-kept garden of the clinic, trying to organize her chaotic thoughts. "If I accept, do you promise my mother will have everything she needs? Not just the surgery, but all the recovery?" asked Claire without turning around. Ethan stood up as well, standing beside her at the window. Ethan placed his hand gently on Claire's shoulder, and she could feel the sincerity in his touch. He solemnly promised that Margaret would have the best treatment available, for as long as necessary, with no limits on cost or duration. Claire closed her eyes, tears running down her face as she made the decision that would change her life forever. She thought of Margaret, of all the sacrifices her mother had made, how she always said there was no shame in any honest work. This would be honest work in its own way. Claire turned and extended her hand to Ethan, her grip firm despite the trembling in her body. The deal was made. Ethan shook her hand with equal firmness, and Claire saw in his eyes not just relief but also admiration. The following hours passed in a haze of anxious waiting, documents being brought for Claire to sign, lawyers appearing to formalize the agreement. Claire signed everything mechanically, her mind focused only on the surgery happening beyond those doors. "It's done then. When my mother recovers, we'll fulfill the agreement," said Claire, her voice empty of emotion. Ethan nodded, understanding that she needed to compartmentalize to survive. The following hours dragged on with torturous slowness, each minute an eternity, as Claire waited for news of Margaret's surgery. Ethan had gone out to make more calls and arrangements, leaving her alone with her thoughts in the luxurious waiting room. Claire alternated between pacing back and forth and sitting down, unable to stay still, but also without energy to maintain constant movement. The television was tuned to a news channel, but she couldn't process anything being said, her mind completely focused on what was happening beyond those double doors. Her nurse appeared every hour to give brief updates. The surgery was progressing, Margaret was stable, the doctors were optimistic. Claire clung to every positive word, as if they were lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. As the 6th hour approached, Ethan returned, bringing coffee and some sandwiches that Claire couldn't touch. They sat in silence, united by the wait, two strangers connected by extraordinary circumstances. "She'll make it. The doctors here are the best in the country," said Ethan, trying to offer comfort. Claire just nodded, unable to form words through the knot in her throat. Finally, after 6 hours and 40 minutes that felt like 6 years, the double doors opened and the chief surgeon emerged. Claire stood up so quickly she felt dizzy, and Ethan steadied her with a hand on her elbow. The doctor was clearly exhausted, his surgical mask stained with sweat, but there was a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes that made Claire's heart race with hope. He approached them, removing his surgical cap, revealing grey hair stuck to his forehead from the effort. Claire tried to read every micro-expression on his face, looking for signs of bad news hidden behind medical professionalism. The surgeon stopped before them, and Claire held her breath, the moment stretching like an elastic about to snap. Ethan kept his hand on her elbow, a silent support she barely registered, all her attention focused on the doctor. The surgery was a complete success. "We managed to repair the aneurysm and drain all the bleeding. Your mother is a fighter, Ms. Claire," said the doctor with a tired but genuine smile. Claire felt her legs give way with relief, and Ethan helped her sit down before she fell. Claire was openly crying now, years of emotional containment breaking like a dam. The doctor continued explaining the details of the surgery and the optimistic prognosis for complete recovery. Ethan asked practical questions about post-operative care, while Claire tried to control her sobs. When she finally managed to compose herself, she asked to see Margaret. In the private ICU, Margaret looked small but had better color, breathing with the help of machines but stable. Claire took her hand, noting the warmth that had returned, and kissed her forehead repeatedly. In the days that followed, Claire established a routine between staying with Margaret and beginning preparations to fulfill her part of the agreement. When Margaret woke up and was strong enough to talk, Claire told her the whole truth, about the agreement, about what she would do to ensure Margaret had the best treatment. Margaret cried, but said she understood and would support Claire unconditionally. Ethan arranged a comfortable apartment for them near the hospital, and the medical examinations for insemination began. "I'll do all the necessary exams. I'll fulfill my part," said Claire during a consultation. Ethan nodded, clearly relieved by her determination. 3 weeks later, with Margaret already able to walk and do physical therapy, the day of the insemination procedure arrived. Claire was nervous but resolute, Margaret at her side offering silent support. The procedure was quick and clinical, and 2 weeks later, the test confirmed Claire was pregnant. Ethan was visibly emotional with the news, promising he would take care of all Claire's medical needs during the pregnancy. The months passed in an established routine of prenatal consultations, Margaret recovering completely, and Claire carrying the Callaway heir. In the 8th month of pregnancy, Ethan insisted it was important for Claire to meet the family before the birth. Claire was reluctant, but eventually agreed, understanding that meeting the family who would raise the child was part of the agreement. The Callaway mansion was imposing but elegant, and Claire immediately felt out of place in her simple clothes. Ethan greeted her nervously and led her to the room where 2 men were waiting. "Father Nathan, this is Claire, the woman who is carrying my heir," Ethan formally introduced. Claire observed the two men rising, Nathan with obvious hostility, and Mr. Calloway with a strange expression. Mr. Calloway was a man in his 60s, still vigorous and with a distinguished bearing, grey hair and a welcoming smile. When he saw Claire, his face lit up with genuine recognition, and he approached with open arms in a warm gesture. Claire immediately remembered him. Mr. Calloway regularly visited the recycling cooperative where she worked, always bringing donations and chatting with the workers. He had been particularly kind to her and Margaret, always asking about their lives, offering extra help when needed. Claire remembered several occasions when he had stopped to talk at length with her about working conditions, about her dreams for the future. He had even encouraged her to take training courses that the foundation offered. Mr. Calloway took her hands warmly, as the old acquaintances they were. Nathan observed the interaction with suspicion, clearly surprised by the familiarity. "Claire, what a joy to see you here. We already know each other, son," exclaimed Mr. Calloway with genuine enthusiasm. Claire smiled, comforted by seeing a familiar and friendly face. Ethan seemed surprised by the previous connection between Claire and his father. Mr. Calloway enthusiastically explained about the various times he had met Claire at the cooperative, about how he always admired her work ethic and honesty. He told a story about a time when Claire had returned an expensive wallet she found in the recycled material, refusing any reward. Nathan rolled his eyes, clearly irritated by his father's praise of Claire. During dinner, Mr. Calloway continued to recall moments when he had interacted with Claire, creating a lighter atmosphere despite Nathan's hostility. He asked about Margaret, showing genuine concern about her recovery. Claire felt more at ease, having an unexpected ally in the family. Nathan, however, became even more suspicious of their closeness, making malicious comments about how convenient it was that Claire knew the family before. "What an interesting coincidence. The waste picker my father helped so much now carrying the family heir," Nathan said venomously. Mr. Calloway reprimanded his son, but Nathan had already planted a dangerous seed. The last weeks of pregnancy passed with Mr. Calloway being extremely supportive and protective of Claire, which deeply irritated Nathan. Mr. Calloway visited Claire and Margaret regularly, always bringing gifts for the baby and food for them, continuing the friendship he had built over the years. Margaret was happy with the visits, remembering all the times he had discreetly helped her family through the cooperative. Nathan used this closeness as ammunition, constantly insinuating to Ethan that his father's interest in Claire was strange. Ethan began to feel uncomfortable, not with romantic suspicions, but questioning if Claire had somehow manipulated the situation, knowing his father's generosity previously. The tension grew each day. In a particularly heated discussion, Nathan said something that planted real doubts in Ethan. "Don't you find it strange that of all the women in the city, you chose precisely the one our father already knew and helped?" Nathan maliciously questioned. Ethan began to distance himself, questioning the coincidences. When contractions began on a sunny afternoon, Claire called Ethan, who responded coldly that he would meet her at the hospital. Margaret accompanied her, offering the support that Ethan had withdrawn in recent weeks. At the hospital, Claire was installed in the luxurious birthing suite. Ethan arrived accompanied by Nathan and Mr. Calloway. Mr. Calloway immediately went to Claire, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement as a close friend would do. Nathan observed everything with calculating eyes, constantly whispering in Ethan's ear. Labor progressed for long hours, with Margaret on one side and Mr. Calloway occasionally checking how she was doing, his paternal and friendly concern contrasting with Ethan's growing coldness. After 12 exhausting hours, the moment finally arrived. The doctor announced that the baby was crowning. Claire gathered her last strength, Margaret holding one hand and whispering encouragement. "One more time, Claire." "Your son is almost here," said the doctor. Claire pushed with everything she had. The strong and healthy cry of the baby filled the room. Claire collapsed from exhaustion and relief as the doctor lifted the baby for everyone to see, a perfect boy. The nurse took the baby to be cleaned and examined. Ethan approached hesitantly, clearly moved despite the doubts Nathan had planted. Mr. Calloway had tears in his eyes, genuinely moved by becoming a grandfather. The nurse finished cleaning the baby and wrapped him in a blue blanket. Ethan asked to hold him, his arms trembling slightly when the nurse placed the baby in them. For a moment, he just looked in wonder at the small face. Then the nurse adjusted the blanket, revealing the baby's neck. Ethan was paralyzed, his face losing all color. On the baby's neck was a distinctive birthmark, a perfect star, dark red, identical to the one Mr. Calloway had in the same place. This isn't possible," whispered Ethan before his legs gave way. He fainted, the nurse quickly taking the baby from his arms. Nathan rushed to the baby while nurses attended to Ethan. When he saw the mark, his face transformed into an expression of malicious triumph. Mr. Calloway approached, and upon seeing the mark identical to his on the baby's neck, was genuinely shocked and confused. Claire, exhausted and confused, didn't understand the commotion. Ethan was revived and helped to sit. When he fully regained consciousness, he looked at Claire with anger and betrayal. Nathan was already whispering in his ear, saying that it was obvious now. Claire and their father had an affair, all the closeness and friendship was a facade. Ethan stood up shakily and accused Claire in front of everyone. Mr. Calloway tried to intervene, saying it was impossible, that he and Claire were just friends, that he had known her since she was a young worker. But Nathan pointed out that they had known each other for years, that his father always had a special interest in her. "How else would you explain that, Mark? It's genetically impossible," shouted Ethan. Claire, holding her newborn baby, had no answer for the impossible. Claire held the baby against her chest, still trembling from the effort of childbirth, while watching the chaos unfold around her in the delivery room. Ethan was standing now, leaning against the wall, his face a mask of anger and confusion, as he looked alternately at her, the baby, and his father. Nathan had a venomous smile on his lips, clearly savoring the doubts he had planted. Mr. Calloway seemed genuinely lost, looking at the mark on the baby's neck as if it might disappear if he blinked enough. Margaret positioned herself protectively beside Claire, her face showing maternal fury at the accusations. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to make breathing difficult. Claire tried to speak, but her voice came out weak and hoarse from the effort of childbirth. She cleared her throat and tried again, needing to defend her honor even in her exhausted state. "Ethan, I swear on my mother's life that there was never anything between me and your father. We are just acquaintances from the cooperative," said Claire, her voice gaining strength with indignation. Ethan looked at her with contempt, clearly not believing. Nathan approached Claire's bed, his eyes gleaming with malice as he pointed to the baby in her arms. He began to list all the coincidences, how Claire had known their father for years, how Mr. Calloway had always shown special interest in her through charitable work, how now the baby had a mark that only the family patriarch possessed. Each word was calculated to deepen Ethan's suspicions, and Claire could see it was working. Mr. Calloway tried to intervene again, his voice showing desperation to clarify the misunderstanding. He explained that he knew Claire only professionally, through work at the cooperative, that he had always helped many families, not just hers. But his words seemed weak in the face of the physical evidence of the birthmark. Ethan approached the bed, his face contorted in an expression of disgust that broke Claire's heart. She instinctively pressed the baby tighter against herself, as if she could protect him from his father's rejection. "You deceived me, used my desperation for an heir to cover up something terrible. How could you?" accused Ethan, his voice trembling. Claire felt tears of frustration and injustice running down her face. Margaret could no longer remain silent and positioned herself between Ethan and Claire, her body still fragile from recovery, but trembling with righteous indignation. She defended her daughter with the ferocity of a lioness, reminding Ethan of Claire's impeccable character, of how she had returned the briefcase full of money even when desperately needing it to save her life. Margaret questioned how he dared doubt Claire after everything she had proven herself to be. Claire's mother recalled each sacrifice her daughter had made, each honest choice even when dishonesty would have been easier and more profitable. Ethan hesitated for a moment, clearly affected by Margaret's reminders, but Nathan quickly intervened with more venom. He suggested that perhaps the entire briefcase situation was calculated, that Claire might have researched Ethan beforehand, knowing of his need for an heir. The theory was absurd and paranoid, but in the emotionally charged atmosphere it gained traction. The baby began to cry, frightened by the raised voices. "My daughter has never lied in her life." "You are incapable of recognizing honesty when you see it," shouted Margaret. Claire rocked the baby, trying to calm him. Claire calmed the baby with gentle movements, humming softly while trying to process the surreal situation in which she found herself. Her body still ached from childbirth, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep, but the adrenaline from the injustice kept her alert. Mr. Calloway approached cautiously, asking to examine the baby's mark more closely. Claire hesitated but allowed it, watching as he compared it with his own mark, pulling his shirt collar to reveal the identical star on his neck. They were absolutely identical. A perfect five-pointed star in dark red. "Mr." Calloway shook his head in genuine confusion, murmuring that he didn't understand how it was possible. It was then that one of the medical team doctors, who had stayed to complete paperwork, intervened. He suggested they perform DNA tests immediately to resolve the issue once and for all. Ethan promptly agreed, demanding the most reliable and fastest laboratory available. Claire also agreed without hesitation, knowing it was her only chance to prove the truth. "Do as many tests as you want. I have nothing to hide," Claire declared firmly. Nathan whispered something in Ethan's ear that made her shudder. The doctor explained they would need to collect DNA samples from everyone involved: Claire, the baby, Ethan, and given the circumstances of the accusations, Mr. Calloway as well. The procedure was simple, just a buccal swab examination, but the results would take a few days even with maximum priority. Ethan insisted on personally accompanying the samples to the laboratory, suspicious that Claire might try something. The insinuation was another blow to Claire's already wounded heart. While the samples were being collected, Nathan continued poisoning his brother's mind, suggesting that Claire had connections in the cooperative, that poor people were capable of anything for money. Mr. Calloway defended Claire, but his defense only fueled more suspicions. Why was he so invested in protecting her? Claire focused on the baby, who had fallen back asleep in her arms, his serene little face unaware of the turmoil around him. The head nurse, seeing the toxic environment, insisted that Claire needed to be transferred to a private room to recover properly. "She just went through childbirth. She needs rest, not interrogation," the nurse said with authority. Ethan coldly agreed. Claire was installed in a luxurious private room, but what should have been a period of recovery and bonding with the newborn became a painful isolation. Ethan left clear instructions. All medical needs would be attended to, but he wanted no contact until the results arrived. Only Margaret was permitted to stay constantly, and Mr. Calloway insisted on visiting daily, despite Nathan's protests. The old Calloway was visibly shaken, repeating that he didn't understand the situation, that his family had a history of that mark appearing randomly. Claire began to breastfeed the baby, each moment bittersweet, knowing that soon she would have to give him up. Margaret cared for both with devotion, preparing nutritious foods and ensuring that Claire rested between feedings. On the second day, Mr. Calloway brought old family albums. He showed photos of his great-grandfather, who had the same mark on his neck. He explained that the mark skipped generations with no clear pattern. His father didn't have it, he had it. His children didn't have it, and now it appeared on his grandson. "See, it's documented here. The mark has always been a genetic mystery in the family," said Mr. Calloway, showing the photos. Claire felt renewed hope. Margaret examined the old photos carefully, noting that there was indeed visual evidence of the mark in alternate generations of the Calloway family. She began taking notes, creating a sort of genealogical tree of the mark's appearances. It was evident that there was no predictable pattern. Sometimes it skipped one generation, sometimes two or three. Mr. Calloway called his older sister who lived abroad, putting the call on speakerphone so Claire could hear. The woman confirmed that she clearly remembered her great-grandfather with the mark, and that it had always been a curiosity in the family how it appeared and disappeared through generations. She mentioned that a distant cousin had also been born with it recently, the child of a branch of the family that had no record of the mark for 4 generations. Claire listened to everything with growing relief. There was a scientific, genetic explanation that didn't involve any impropriety. Nathan appeared during this conversation, and dismissed it all as too convenient. He insinuated that Claire might have researched the family history, but Mr. Calloway lost his patience. "Enough, Nathan. Your malice is destroying our family," shouted the patriarch. Nathan left, slamming the door. On the third day of waiting, Claire was changing the baby when Ethan unexpectedly appeared. He stood in the doorway, watching her care for the child with natural and loving movements. For a moment, Claire saw something soften in his expression, but then he composed himself and kept his distance. He had come to inform her that the laboratory had promised the results for the next day. Claire took the opportunity to try to talk, explain again that she would never betray him, that their agreement was sacred to her. Ethan listened in silence, his face an indecipherable mask. When the baby started crying, Claire calmed him with an ease that came from maternal instinct. Ethan observed the scene, and Claire could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that child as his, but Nathan's poison still ran in his veins. Before leaving, Ethan stopped at the door and said something that gave Claire hope. He mentioned that he had researched genetics and discovered that complex birthmarks like that one really could have unpredictable inheritance patterns. "If the test proves he's my son, I will ask for forgiveness," Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded, tears in her eyes. The fourth day dawned with palpable tension. Mr. Calloway arrived early, bringing more family medical documentation he had obtained from distant relatives. These were old medical records that mentioned the Calloway star mark as a rare genetic characteristic that appeared irregularly in the lineage. A document from a doctor of the last century speculated that it was a benign genetic mutation that had incomplete penetrance, technical terms to say it could skip generations unpredictably. Margaret had spent the night researching in medical books that Mr. Calloway had brought, finding similar cases in other families around the world. Claire was feeding the baby while listening to Margaret read excerpts about complex genetic inheritance, about how certain traits could remain dormant for generations before reappearing. Nathan appeared mid-morning, clearly irritated with the campaign to exonerate Claire. He accused his father of being manipulated, of being so desperate for a grandchild that he would accept any explanation. Mr. Calloway calmly replied that science doesn't lie. "The truth will come with the DNA test, Nathan, and when it does, I hope you'll have the decency to apologize," said Mr. Calloway. Nathan snorted and left. In the afternoon of the fourth day, Claire was resting with the baby when a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. She heard Ethan's voice, urgent and anxious. The door opened and he entered, followed by Mr. Calloway, Nathan, and the doctor responsible for the tests. The doctor carried a sealed envelope. The results had arrived earlier than expected. Margaret held Claire's hand while everyone positioned themselves in the room. The doctor asked permission to open the results there, in front of everyone, so there would be no doubts about their authenticity. Claire agreed, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The doctor carefully broke the seal and removed the documents. He examined the papers, his professional face revealing nothing. The silence in the room was oppressive. Even the baby was quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The doctor cleared his throat and began to read the results in a clear and professional voice. "First, I confirm that Claire Collins is the biological mother of the child," he began. This had never been questioned, but needed to be established. The doctor continued, his voice maintaining the neutral and professional tone as he read the results that would change everything. He explained that the test had analyzed multiple genetic markers to establish paternity with absolute certainty. Mr. Calloway was tested first, given the suspicions raised. The doctor looked directly at him and clearly announced that Mr. Calloway was not the biological father of the child. Claire saw relief pass across the old gentleman's face, who murmured a silent thank you. Nathan looked surprised, clearly expecting to confirm his malicious suspicions. The doctor then turned to Ethan, who was rigid as a statue. The tension in the room was almost palpable when the doctor continued. He explained that Ethan's DNA analysis had been compared with the child's at multiple points. The results were conclusive and irrefutable. The doctor paused, looking to make sure everyone was paying attention. "Ethan Calloway is the biological father of the child with 99% certainty. There is no doubt whatsoever about paternity," the doctor declared with finality. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire closed her eyes and let tears of relief flow freely down her face. Margaret let out a sigh that seemed to have been held for days and hugged her daughter. "Mr. Calloway smiled broadly, clearly happy with the confirmation. But all eyes were on Ethan, who had turned as pale as paper. He looked from the doctor to Claire, to the baby, processing the magnitude of his mistake. Nathan tried to stammer something about the possibility of error, but the doctor cut him off, explaining that he had done double tests to ensure absolute accuracy. Ethan took a step forward, then another, slowly approaching the bed where Claire held the baby. His face showed a mixture of emotions: shame, regret, relief, and something that seemed to be deep pain. He stopped beside the bed and, to everyone's shock, fell to his knees. Claire watched him with a mixture of compassion and hurt as he struggled to find words. "Claire, I made a terrible mistake. I doubted you, I accused you of horrible things," Ethan began, his voice breaking. He looked at her with eyes full of tears. Ethan remained on his knees, his hands trembling as he tried to articulate the magnitude of his regret. Tears ran openly down his face, all the composure of the successful businessman completely destroyed by shame and remorse. He explained how he had allowed Nathan's poison to infect his mind, how he had allowed prejudices about social class to cloud his judgment about Claire's impeccable character. He apologized repeatedly, each word laden with genuine regret. Claire watched in silence, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Mr. Calloway placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, clearly moved to see his son acknowledge his mistake. Nathan had retreated to the corner, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. Margaret was the one who broke the silence, her voice strong and clear. She said that forgiveness would not erase the pain that Claire had suffered, accused and humiliated, in her most vulnerable moment. "You have a son now, Ethan. A son who needs a better father than you have been these past few days," Margaret said firmly. Ethan nodded, accepting the reprimand. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but laden with contained emotion. She said she understood the shock of seeing the mark, that she understood how appearances could be deceiving, but she also made it clear how much it had hurt to be accused of something so horrible, especially after all the sacrifice she had made. She had carried his child for 9 months, had fulfilled every part of the agreement with honor, only to be treated like a criminal at the most vulnerable moment of her life. Ethan listened to every word like deserved lashes, nodding and accepting all blame. Claire then did something that surprised everyone. She extended the baby to Ethan. It was the first time he would have the chance to hold his son, knowing for certain that he was his. Ethan looked at her with surprise and gratitude, slowly rising and taking the baby with hands trembling with emotion. The moment he held his son for the first time, truly as a father, was powerful. "His name will be Gabriel Calloway," said Ethan, looking to Claire for approval. Claire nodded, a small peace settling between them. The days following the DNA test were marked by growing tension in the Calloway mansion. Claire remained in the hospital for a few more days, recovering while Ethan visited daily, growing closer to Gabriel. Nathan, however, had not disappeared as everyone had hoped. On the contrary, he was articulating behind the scenes, spreading rumors among the company executives about Claire being a scammer who had seduced Ethan. On the 5th day after the test, Claire was discharged, and Ethan insisted that she go straight to the mansion with Margaret and Gabriel. The arrival was tense. Nathan was at the entrance, clearly furious, having waited for hours. Claire held Gabriel protectively, while Margaret positioned herself by her side. Ethan got out of the car and immediately placed himself between Nathan and the women, his face showing iron determination. "Mr. Calloway watched from the door, clearly concerned about the approaching confrontation. "You may have convinced my idiot brother, but you don't fool me. I know exactly what kind of woman you are. An opportunistic trash picker who saw a golden chance," shouted Nathan, pointing accusingly at Claire. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched in clear restraint. Claire held Gabriel tight against her chest, while Nathan continued his torrent of accusations, each word more poisonous than the last. Margaret tried to step forward to defend her daughter, but Claire gently held her back with her free arm, knowing she needed to hear everything in order to move forward afterward. The mansion staff had gathered at the windows and entrance, some having left their posts to witness the confrontation everyone knew was inevitable. Nathan was red with anger, gesturing violently while pouring out years of accumulated envy and resentment. Mr. Calloway descended the steps slowly, his face showing deep disappointment with his eldest son's behavior, but also determination to end this once and for all. Gabriel began to cry, frightened by the shouting and negative energy, and Claire gently rocked him, whispering words of comfort in his ear. Look at her, a garbage picker pretending to be the mother of the Calloway heir. Do you really believe she didn't plan all this? That she didn't research our family beforehand? She knew about the birthmark, must have discovered it somehow. Nathan shouted, turning to the gathered staff. Ethan took a deep breath, clearly gathering control before responding. Enough, Nathan. Your jealousy and bitterness have poisoned this family for too long. You want to talk about character? Then let's talk. Let's expose everything here now in front of everyone, shouted Ethan, his voice echoing across the courtyard with an authority that made everyone pay attention. He turned to the staff present, ensuring everyone heard every word of what he was about to reveal. This woman you call an opportunist returned a briefcase with enough money to save her mother's life. She chose honesty even knowing it condemned Margaret to death. She had in her hands the solution to all her problems and chose to do the right thing. Meanwhile, you, Nathan, have been embezzling millions from the company for years. Yes, I discovered everything. The fake accounts, the inflated contracts, the bribes, everything, revealed Ethan, each accusation falling like a bomb. Nathan turned as pale as paper, clearly not expecting his crimes to be exposed publicly like this. The staff whispered in shock among themselves, some discreetly recording with their phones. That's a lie. You're making this up to protect your garbage-picking lover. You've always been weak, Ethan, always, Nathan shouted desperately. Mr. Calloway stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air. No, Nathan. I verified the records myself after Ethan alerted me. It's all true. Every cent diverted, every fraudulent contract, every lie you told. You betrayed us while pretending moral superiority, while thinking yourself better than everyone, said Mr. Calloway, his voice heavy with disappointment and contained anger. Nathan looked at his father as if he had been slapped, clearly not expecting him to take Ethan's side so definitively. You always preferred Ethan, always. Since we were children, he was always the favorite. I did everything for the company, worked day and night while he played playboy, and for what? To see you hand everything over to a garbage picker and her bastard? This is the height of humiliation. Exploded Nathan, all his accumulated bitterness of years overflowing in poisonous words. Claire felt each insult like a stab, especially the cruel reference to Gabriel. But before she could react, Ethan advanced on Nathan with surprising speed, stopping inches from his face. Never again refer to my son that way. Gabriel is more Calloway than you ever were. He carries not just our blood, but the example of honor and dignity from his mother. Something you would never understand, roared Ethan. Margaret moved protectively closer to Claire. The confrontation had now attracted all the mansion staff, gardeners, maids, cooks, drivers, all forming a large semicircle around the family in conflict. Nathan, realizing he was losing everyone's support, tried one last desperate move to turn the game around. He turned to the staff with a cruel smile and began to talk about tradition, about what the company founder would think seeing a garbage picker running the Calloway empire. You don't understand. She will destroy everything our great-grandfather built. A garbage picker has no education, no class, no knowledge to be part of this family. What does she know about business, about etiquette, about our tradition? Do you want to be led by someone who rummaged through trash to survive? Shouted Nathan, appealing to any prejudice he could find. Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness and disappointment. Tradition? You want to talk about tradition, Nathan? Let me tell everyone here about our great-grandfather, since you seem to have forgotten, said Ethan, turning to all those present. His voice gained strength as he continued. Our great-grandfather came to this country as an immigrant, without speaking the language, without a penny in his pocket. He worked as a shoe shiner, as a porter at the harbor, as anything he could to survive. He built this fortune with honest work, sacrifice, and most importantly, integrity. He would be more like Claire than like you, Nathan. She knows the real value of work, sacrifice, honesty. Values that you abandoned the moment you decided you deserved more just for being born with our last name, declared Ethan, his voice echoing with passion. Mr. Calloway nodded vigorously, clearly moved by the memory of his father. Claire felt tears in her eyes as she heard Ethan not only defending her, but recognizing her real value, comparing her to the founder of the Calloway dynasty. And as for business, I'd prefer 1,000 times someone who knows the value of every cent, who understands people's real needs, than someone who steals millions thinking they're clever, Ethan completed. Nathan was shaking with rage now, his face contorted into an ugly expression. You'll regret this, Ethan. You're destroying our family for some random woman. Nathan spat. That was the last straw. Ethan completely lost control and lunged at Nathan, shoving him hard against the mansion wall. Mr. Calloway had to physically intervene, holding Ethan back while Nathan recovered from the impact. Claire passed Gabriel to Margaret and approached, placing her hand gently on Ethan's arm, her touch having an immediate calming effect. Ethan was breathing heavily, struggling to regain control, while Nathan straightened himself, adjusting his crumpled suit. The moment of silence that followed was heavy, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. It was Mr. Calloway who broke the silence, his voice carrying the authority of decades as the family patriarch. He positioned himself in the center between his two sons and looked directly at Nathan with an expression that Claire had never seen before. It was pure disappointment, mixed with determination. Nathan, you've crossed all lines today. Not only have you insulted an honorable woman and her innocent child, but you've revealed the rot in your character that I've refused to see for too long, said Mr. Calloway, his voice firm. Nathan tried to protest, but his father raised his hand to silence him. I'm not finished. You stole from the company that your great-grandfather built with blood and sweat. You betrayed the family's trust. You spread poison and discord where there should be unity. And now you insult the mother of my grandson, a woman who has shown more honor in one day than you have in your entire life. Nathan Calloway, you are no longer welcome in this house. You are banished from the family and the company. Leave now and never come back, declared Mr. Calloway, each word falling like a sentence. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Nathan looked from his father to Ethan to Claire, searching for some sign that this was a bluff, an empty threat. But he found only iron determination. Father, you can't do this. I am your son. I have rights. Half of all this is mine by right, shouted Nathan, desperation finally appearing in his voice. Mr. Calloway shook his head sadly. You lost your rights when you chose greed over family. The lawyers will take care of the legal details. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave. If you try to return, I will call the police, said Mr. Calloway with finality. Nathan looked around for support, but found only hostile or embarrassed faces. Claire watched the scene unfold with a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness at seeing a family shatter, but relief in knowing that Nathan's poison could no longer reach her or Gabriel. Margaret approached with the baby, who had calmed down and was now observing everything with curious little eyes. Nathan gave one last hate-filled look at Claire before turning and entering the mansion, presumably to get his things. The staff began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the drama they had witnessed. Ethan approached Claire, his face showing emotional exhaustion. He gently touched Gabriel's face, who babbled something incomprehensible but happy. Mr. Calloway joined them, forming a protective circle around Claire and Gabriel. During the next hour they remained in the garden, watching as Nathan went in and out carrying boxes to his car. No words were exchanged, but the silence was eloquent. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Mr. Calloway finally said. Claire shook her head, adjusting Gabriel in her arms. It wasn't your fault. Nathan chose his own path, Claire replied gently. When Nathan finally left, speeding down the property entrance with one last hateful glance, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Ethan turned to Claire with a serious expression. Claire, I need to talk to you about something important. About the future of the company and our future, said Ethan. Claire felt her heart race but nodded. They entered the mansion, now free from Nathan's toxic presence, and headed to the main office. Mr. Calloway stayed with Margaret and Gabriel, giving them privacy. In the office, Ethan began explaining his plans. With Nathan gone and his crimes exposed, the company needed a complete restructuring. But more than that, Ethan had an epiphany about what really mattered in life. "Claire, you taught me something fundamental. Character is worth more than birth. Honesty is worth more than wealth, and true love is worth more than any fortune," said Ethan, his eyes fixed on hers. Claire felt the words touch her heart. A week after Nathan's dramatic expulsion, the Calloway mansion was unrecognizable in its atmosphere. The constant tension had been replaced by a cautious but genuine peace. Claire and Margaret had properly settled into their quarters, with Gabriel thriving under the loving care of the entire family. On that specific morning, Ethan called an extraordinary meeting in the mansion's conference room. Claire entered carrying Gabriel. Finding the room full of company executives, lawyers, and board members, Ethan stood up when she entered, as did Mr. Calloway, in a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by those present. Margaret was seated in a special chair they had arranged for her, clearly proud but trying not to show it. Ethan cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying natural authority. "I called everyone here today to announce fundamental changes to the structure of Calloway Company and the leadership of our family business," he began. Claire felt a chill in her stomach, not knowing what to expect. "After much reflection and consultation with my father and our lawyers, I've made decisions that some might consider radical, but which I believe are essential for the future of Calloway Company," Ethan continued. He made a dramatic pause, ensuring he had everyone's full attention. "First, I am transferring 51% of the company's shares to my son, Gabriel Calloway, with his mother, Claire Collins, as trustee and administrator until he comes of age. Second, and perhaps more importantly, I am appointing Claire as the new president of Calloway Company, effective immediately," Ethan announced. The room exploded in shocked murmurs, some executives clearly scandalized, others curious. Claire almost dropped Gabriel, so shocked was she. "Ethan, this is madness. I know nothing about running a company. I was a garbage picker. I have no formal education, no experience." Claire protested, her face burning with embarrassment and panic. Ethan smiled calmly and approached her. "Claire, you survived with almost nothing for years. You made impossible decisions with wisdom and integrity. You chose honesty over survival. You know the real value of work, understand the needs of ordinary people, and most importantly, you haven't been corrupted by power and money. These are exactly the qualities our company needs now," Ethan explained, his voice full of conviction. "Mr. Calloway stood up to add his support. "Claire brought something to this family that we had lost for generations: authenticity, true honor, moral courage. With proper guidance, and she will have the best consultants and mentors, I believe Claire will take Calloway Company to a new level of success and social responsibility," the patriarch declared. One of the older executives, a man who had worked with Calloway's great-grandfather, surprisingly raised his hand in support. "If I may speak, I knew the founder of this company. He started from nothing, like Claire. Perhaps that's exactly what we need. To return to our roots," he said. Others began to murmur in agreement. Claire was still in shock, but Margaret stood up and went to her, taking Gabriel from her arms. Claire's mother whispered words of encouragement and strength in her ear, reminding her of everything she had overcome. Ethan continued explaining his plans. He would remain as CEO, working in partnership with Claire, teaching her about the business while she brought fresh perspectives and renewed values. It would be a true partnership, combining experience with innovation, tradition with change. Lawyers began distributing documents, and Claire saw her name on contracts she never imagined signing. The meeting continued for hours, with discussions about restructuring, about Nathan's crimes being investigated, about the company's future. Claire gradually found her voice, asking questions, suggesting ideas about corporate social responsibility that surprised executives with their sensibility. When the meeting finally ended, Claire was exhausted, but strangely energized. "For you can do this, Claire. I will be by your side every step," Ethan promised. Claire looked at Gabriel in Margaret's arms and nodded determinedly. 3 months had passed since that transformative meeting. Claire had surprised everyone, including herself, with her adaptation to the corporate world. Her unique approach, combining pragmatism learned in poverty with genuine compassion for people, had revolutionized the Callaway Company culture. She had implemented inclusive hiring programs, bringing talent from underprivileged areas that would never have had a chance before. Several of her former colleagues from the cooperative now worked in various sectors of the company, proving that competence didn't depend on birthright. The company had launched a robust foundation focused on education and opportunities for disadvantaged communities. Something Claire insisted was not charity, but investment in the future. Profits, surprisingly, had increased, with the company's new image attracting conscious consumers and international partners impressed with the transformation. Margaret had become a beloved figure in the mansion, a sort of universal grandmother who advised employees, cared for Gabriel, and kept Claire grounded in her roots. "Never forget where we came from, daughter," Margaret always reminded Claire. Mr. Callaway was radiant, more alive than he had been in years. The relationship between Claire and Ethan had evolved naturally over these months. What began as a business arrangement had transformed into a genuine partnership, then friendship, and now something deeper was flourishing. Ethan had repeatedly proven that his change was real and permanent, treating Claire with genuine respect and admiration. They worked together during the day, dined as a family at night, and on weekends took Gabriel to parks, like any normal family. The birthmark on Gabriel's neck, which had almost destroyed everything, was now seen as a symbol of how fate works in mysterious ways. On that specific day, it was Gabriel's first birthday, and the mansion was magnificently decorated. Claire had insisted that the party be open to everyone, company employees, cooperative workers, neighbors from the community where she grew up. It was an unlikely mixture of worlds, but it worked. "A year ago, I was desperate in the hospital, thinking I would lose my mother," reflected Claire, observing the party from the terrace. Ethan approached, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. "And now you've transformed not just your life, but the lives of hundreds of people through the company. You've brought soul to an empire that had lost its heart," said Ethan, softly kissing her temple. Claire turned to face him, seeing in his eyes something that made her tremble, genuine, deep, real love. "Ethan, when all this started, I never imagined," Claire began, but he gently silenced her with a finger to her lips. "I know. Neither did I. But sometimes the best destinies are those we don't plan," said Ethan. At that moment, Gabriel appeared crawling quickly, having escaped from Margaret, and grabbed Claire's legs. "Mama! Papa!" he said clearly, looking from Claire to Ethan. These were his first words beyond babbling. Claire picked him up, tears of joy streaming down her face. Ethan wrapped both in his arms, and for a moment, the world seemed perfect. "Mr. Callaway came up to the terrace carrying an old wooden box. He opened it to reveal a family photo album, dating back generations. Claire saw photos of great-grandfather Callaway in his immigrant days, working at the ports, his hands calloused like hers had been. There were photos of the family's evolution, from the small store that became an empire. Mr. Callaway pointed to a specific photo, the elderly great-grandfather surrounded by family, the birthmark clearly visible on his neck. You know what he always said? That the mark appeared on those destined to renew the family, to bring necessary change. He had it, it skipped 2 generations, I have it, it skipped Ethan and Nathan, and now Gabriel has it. Perhaps it's not a coincidence, Claire. Perhaps you and Gabriel were destined to save not just the company, but the soul of the Callaways," said Mr. Callaway emotionally. Claire embraced the old gentleman, this man who had fully accepted her as family. "Thank you for believing in me," Claire whispered. Mr. Callaway smiled. The party continued until late at night with music, dancing, and a genuine joy that hadn't been seen at the Callaway mansion for a long time. Claire's former colleagues from the cooperative chatted with executives, social barriers temporarily forgotten in the celebration. Margaret was in her element, telling embarrassing stories from Claire's childhood to anyone who would listen, making everyone laugh. At one point, Ethan asked for everyone's attention and gave an emotional speech about family, about how Claire had taught them all the true meaning of wealth. He ended by doing something that surprised everyone, especially Claire. He knelt before her, right in front of everyone. Claire felt her heart stop when she saw the velvet box in his hand. Claire Collins, you entered my life returning a fortune that could have saved your mother. You taught me about honor, true love, about what really matters. You transformed our company, our family, and most importantly, you transformed me. I fell in love not with my son's mother, but with the extraordinary woman that you are. Will you marry me? Not for Gabriel, not for the company, but because I love you, Ethan asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Claire looked around. Margaret crying with joy, Mr. Calloway smiling broadly, the guests holding their breath and Gabriel in her arms babbling happily. Claire felt the moment crystallize around her, as if time had stopped. She thought about her entire journey, from the recycling cooperative to the top of the Calloway empire, from the despair of almost losing Margaret to the joy of having a complete family. Each moment of pain had led to this. Each difficult choice had paved the way for this happiness. She looked at Ethan, kneeling before her, vulnerable and sincere, so different from the cold man she had met a year ago. Claire handed Gabriel to Margaret and knelt too, coming to Ethan's level, a gesture that surprised him. Ethan Calloway, you accused me of the worst, humiliated me in my most vulnerable moment, but you also gave me the chance to save my mother. You learned to see beyond appearances, to value what truly matters. You became the father Gabriel deserves and the man I didn't even know I could love. Yes, I accept. But not just as your wife, as your equal, your partner in everything, Claire responded. Ethan kissed her right there, still kneeling, while the guests erupted in applause and cheers. 6 months later, Claire and Ethan's wedding was an event that went down in the city's history. Not for its luxury, though there was some, but for the genuine union of two worlds. The ceremony was held in the mansion gardens, decorated with simple flowers that Claire personally chose. The guest list was a reflection of the new Calloway philosophy. Cooperative workers seated next to business people, residents from the outskirts sharing tables with the social elite. Claire wore an elegant but simple dress, refusing the excesses that the planners had suggested. Gabriel, now walking confidently, was the ring-bearer, stealing the show with his crooked tie and radiant smile. Margaret, dressed with dignity in a dress that Claire insisted on buying from the best store in the city, radiated maternal pride. Mr. Calloway officiated the ceremony, having obtained special permission, and his words about love, redemption, and renewal made everyone cry. Today we celebrate not only the union of Claire and Ethan, but the proof that true love transcends all barriers, he said. Nathan was not present, obviously, but had sent a cold congratulatory card from abroad, where he now lived. During the reception, Claire gave a speech that surprised everyone. She announced that the Calloway Foundation was launching a revolutionary microcredit and education program for waste pickers and informal workers, something she had secretly planned with Ethan. The program would bear the name of Margaret Collins, in honor of the woman who had inspired everything with her dignity and strength. Margaret openly cried, embraced by Mr. Calloway, who had become her great friend. The party continued into the night, with Claire dancing first with Ethan, then with Mr. Calloway, and even with some of her former waste picker colleagues who had been invited. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of a social transformation that many thought impossible. Gabriel slept in Margaret's lap, the mark on his neck visible, no longer a symbol of suspicion but of fulfilled destiny. Who would have thought that returning a briefcase would change our lives so much? Claire whispered to Ethan during a slow dance. Ethan twirled her gently, smiling. 2 years passed. Calloway Company had become a model of corporate social responsibility, with record profits proving that ethics and success could go hand in hand. Claire had completed her formal education through private tutors, surprising everyone with her ability to absorb knowledge. She now led meetings with confidence, negotiated international contracts, and had become a sought-after speaker on transformational leadership. Ethan had found his purpose supporting Claire and being the father he always wanted to be for Gabriel, and now for little Sophia, born a year after the wedding. The girl was born without the family mark, but with Claire's determined eyes. Margaret lived her golden days surrounded by love, taking care of her grandchildren and advising Claire in important moments. Mr. Calloway, rejuvenated by the love of his renewed family, had become an active philanthropist working directly with the communities that the foundation supported. Nathan had never returned, but occasional news arrived that he lived modestly abroad, perhaps finally learning the value of honest work. The cooperative where Claire had worked was now a partner of Callaway Company, with dignified conditions and fair wages for all workers. On a particular morning, Claire was in her office, the same one where Ethan had made the proposal that changed everything, reviewing reports with Gabriel playing at her feet. The boy, now 3 years old, was the perfect mixture of his parents, Claire's determination with Ethan's natural charm. Sophia slept in a nearby crib, supervised by Margaret, who was knitting in an armchair. Ethan entered with Mr. Callaway, both smiling mysteriously. "What are you two plotting?" Claire asked suspiciously. Ethan showed her a document. It was the deed to a huge plot of land in the suburbs. "We're going to build a complete community center. Education, health, professional training. It will be the company's largest social project," Ethan announced. Claire stood up emotionally, hugging both men. "What are we going to call it?" she asked. Mr. Callaway smiled. "Gabriel Community Center, in honor of the boy who united two worlds," he said. Gabriel looked up, hearing his name, the mark on his neck glistening in the morning light. Claire went to the window, observing the mansion gardens where employees had lunch at tables she had ordered installed, creating a more human and less hierarchical environment. She could see former colleagues from the cooperative now in positions of responsibility, proving daily that talent doesn't choose social class. Ethan approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her, Sophia waking with the movement and babbling happily. Margaret rose to take her granddaughter, and Mr. Callaway lifted Gabriel onto his shoulders. There in that office where everything had begun with suspicions and accusations was now a family united by choice, not just blood. Claire thought about her journey, every moment of despair, every impossible choice, every tear she'd had led to this happiness she never dared to dream of. "You know what I've learned?" Claire said, turning to face her family. "That integrity may seem like a curse when you're at the bottom, but it's the only real ladder to get out of there. I returned that briefcase thinking I was condemning my mother, but I was saving much more than one life," she said. Ethan kissed her softly. "Did you enjoy story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you."